Okay, welcome back everyone. So today we are going to be making our player character and then integrate it into our main scene. So let's dive in. So to create the player character scene, let's create a new scene by clicking this plus button up here. And we're going to select a root node, specifically a rigid body 3D for our player character. So I'm going to click other node and then I'm going to go to rigid body, make sure it's rigid body 3D. And so a rigid body 3D is a physics body that simulates realistic physics interactions in a 3D environment. So this is going to be basically the physics property for our marble character, our ball character, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so now that we have that, let's add a mesh instance 3D. So I'm going to hit Control A, mesh instance 3D. And let's go to that drop down menu over here where it says mesh, and I'm going to choose a sphere mesh because that is going to be our marble that we're going to be controlling. Now let's also add a collision shape 3D as a child of the mesh instance 3D node. So I'm going to hit Control A again and then go to collision shape 3D. Now you'll see that there's a little error here. It says shape must be provided. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here and sphere shape. I'm also going to actually make it a child of the rigid body 3D node. There we go. So rigid body and the rigid body 3D node has two children. Mesh instance 3D, collision shape 3D. There we go. And let's save. So I'm actually going to rename this to player. Control S to save. Let's go over to scenes, and then we have our player.scene, so let's save that. And what we want to do is let's instantiate our player character into the main scene. So I'm going to come up to the main scene, I'm going to make sure that my main node is selected, and I'm either going to hit this link icon or I'm going to hit Control Shift A, and I'm going to instantiate the player. Okay, pretty cool. So let's move it up a little bit just that way it's not in the ground. Perfect. Okay, so I think that we should fine-tune this a little bit. It's a little big and I want to add some color to it just so that way it's not this kind of boring white color. So let's go over to player, and remember any changes we make in this scene will take place in this scene as well, as long as it's instantiated. So let's go back to the player scene. Alternatively, we can also kind of hit this clacker icon. Let's see. So I think we can probably make it, let's make it probably like half the size. So let's go over to mesh instance 3D. I'm going to click this little drop down menu, and I'm just going to divide these numbers in half. So the radius is going to be, instead of 0.5, it's going to be 0.25, and the height is going to be 0.5. Now that looks pretty good to me, but the problem is that the collision shape 3D is still the same size. So how do we go about fixing that? Well, same thing, come down here, the radius 0.5, we want to cut that in half, 0.25. And there we go. That should be pretty good. Last thing that we want to do is let's change the color of our player. I think that we can make something a little bit more interesting than this. So there's a few ways to go about that. One thing we can do is we can come down to this in the properties panel for the mesh instance 3D node, come down to the geometry, material override, new standard material. Now we can make it any color that we want. However, I am actually going to use this icon.svg and just drag it into the texture node. And now you'll see that that icon is now wrapped around our marble. Now it doesn't look awesome, it doesn't look like the greatest texture ever, but I like it just because it kind of gives us an indication of which way the marble is facing, and this is going to come in handy later on when we're dealing with camera positioning and things like that. So I think for now, my recommendation, use the icon.svg, drag it over to the texture slot, and just leave it as is. And now that we've made these changes in the player scene, let's see if they take effect in the main scene. And yep, they did. It's about 50% smaller, and it has the texture wrapped around it. Very cool. So, okay, so in this lesson, we've created our player character scene, and instantiated it into the main scene. In our next lesson, we're going to explore adding the controls to our game. So stay tuned.